My name's Sarah B., and this show is called Time and Other Thieves, Reflections and Conversations on the Nature of Existence. This episode originally aired in radio format on August 12th, 2021. Today I'm going to talk about Diaries. If you heard the episode I did a few weeks back on the book Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, you might recall me saying that I'm obsessed with diaries. My obsession developed in the fall of 2016 when my Aunt Drusy and Uncle Kenny gave me a box, an archival quality Hollinger box to be exact, full of my late paternal grandmother's diaries. Grammy, as all her grandkids knew her, had died 3 Septembers earlier in her sleep after many years of what my doctor dad termed the dwindles. I had not known until my aunt asked me if I'd like to see some of Grammy's diaries that my grandmother had been a diarist. I knew she'd been a prolific letter writer, but not a diarist. And my dad, who's been a devoted diary writer himself since
December 31st, 1984.
also had no idea. Before that fateful Thanksgiving, when Drusy led me upstairs to her and Kenny's archival room, they both held long careers as archivists for the state of North Carolina, I was a big fan of diaries. One of my favorite books was and is the collected journals of Sylvia Plath. I had dabbled in Anne Frank, Anais Nin, Virginia Woolf, and I'd kept a journal myself for 16 years at that point. Not a diary like my dad's, which detailed each day's happenings, but a journal which detailed the happenings of what I deemed the really important days, and more frequently what I deemed the really important thoughts and feelings. While my dad's diary was
Just reporting the news pretty much.
with hardly a mention of his internal world, my journals had been almost entirely focused on that world. This habit has since changed, but I'll get to that later. The first box of my grandmother's diaries that I borrowed soon became a second box and then a third. I was so taken with them and felt so strongly that everyone in my family should read them, and maybe non-family members too, that I started typing them up as I read. So far, I've typed 635 single-space pages in Times New Roman 12-point font, and my work is not nearly finished. These pages encompass what Grammy wrote between 1938 and 1945, with only a small fraction of 1938 yet typed, and that is a beast of a diary, and between 1970 and 1974. So there's this mysterious gap in diaries between 1945 and 1970, which my family can only assume that Grammy's bearing and raising of 5 children could account for. That would be understandable, but I find it hard to believe that my grandmother went from being such a dedicated diary writer, using leather-bound books, loose-leaf notebook paper, or any other blank page she could get her hands on as a place to record the day's events and her many thoughts and feelings, to not documenting a single thing about her life for 2.5 decades. Something must have happened to those writings. Maybe they were lost or accidentally damaged, or maybe they were intentionally destroyed. I simply can't imagine Grammy not writing, for instance, about her first pregnancy or the birth of her first child. I wish she were still alive today so I could ask her about that 25-year gap. When the diaries do resume, my grandmother is in her late 40s. We last saw her at 22, feeling nervous in a good way about the man she'd just started dating, the man who would become her husband, my grandfather. He'd just kissed her for the first time, her first ever kiss of a romantic nature, and she'd uncharacteristically written nothing about it aside from noting it had happened. Maybe there's a certain girlishness in the desire to describe such things in detail, and in being kissed, that girlishness vanished. And with it, her diary habit. The next time we see her, she's 47, filling up stenographer notebooks with passages transcribed verbatim from the Bible and from other Bible-related texts. The life and the love of life that had characterized her younger diaries is nowhere to be seen. Her spiritedness replaced by anything to do with the Holy Spirit. What was initially most surprising to me about my grandmother's diaries was how much religious doubt they conveyed. For as long as I'd known her, a total of 32 years, Grammy had seemed unwavering in her Christian faith. Every letter she ever wrote to me, and there were many, contained at least one mention of how much God loved me. Every Christmas and birthday gift was somehow God-themed. And she walked the talk too, volunteering countless hours at the local homeless shelter and giving back to her community in so many other ways that the town of Tarboro, North Carolina, declared September 23rd, 1995, Patty Simpson Day. Everyone who knew Patty Simpson loved Patty Simpson. But Patty Simpson did not love herself. Her diaries make this abundantly clear. For her, being unable to love herself meant that she could not trust that God loved her. Intellectually, in an abstract sense, she knew God loved her, but she couldn't feel that love, or to use a modern phrase, she couldn't lean into it. Again and again she wrote in her diary about knowing that she just needed to relax, to just be herself, to look for God in other people, to stop being so fearful and self-conscious. The fact that she so often circled back to the importance of relaxing makes me wonder if she read Bernard Bassett's We Neurotics book, which I talked about a couple weeks ago on Time and Other Thieves. It's basically about the spiritual benefits of lying on the floor every day, because God is not at his best until we are relaxed. Aside from being surprised by the intensity of my grandmother's religious doubt, as it was portrayed in her diaries, I was also simply amazed by how alive her writing was. I'm referring in particular here to her younger diaries, those written when she was a teenager and then a college student. Not only were those cursive covered pages portals into her mind and heart, but they were also time machines, transporting me, with that first notebook I opened, to New York in 1945, when Grammy was a 20-year-old student at the University of Rochester. Other notebooks have taken me farther back in time, to Grammy's hometown of Harriman, Tennessee, and to her beloved Oliphant, Ontario, where she and her parents would vacation every summer. And jumping ahead through the years again, her diaries have taken me to Columbia, Missouri, where she attended Stevens College in 1944. She wrote about these places and all of the people with whom she interacted in such detail that to read her words is to be with her in those places and with those people. In reading her diaries, I came to know, inasmuch as we can really know any other person, Patty Ann Watkins. That younger version of her might have been vastly different from the grandmother version I knew in real life, but I think all old people contain the young people they once were. And reading her diaries hammered home to me in a more than intellectual way the profound fact that every old person was once young, that every dead person was once very much alive. And even beyond that, Grammy's diaries have made me wonder if any life ever really ends. When I read her 1938 diary, for instance, I get the wonderfully haunting feeling that she is still 13 years old, playing gangster with her neighborhood friends on Cumberland Avenue in Harriman. And when I read her 1941 diary, I sense that she is still 17, teaching her best friend Mary how to float in Lake Huron. It makes sense that I'd be pondering time-related concepts on a show called Time and Other Thieves, especially in an episode that's focused on diaries. A diary is, among other things, a way to protect oneself against the thieveries of time. It is a way to remember what we would otherwise forget, and after we've died, it is a way to be remembered by others who would elsewise not even know we existed. It's a way to live forever in the minds of those who read our words. One could argue, as Randall and Linda Miller do in the introduction to their wonderful Book of American Diaries, that diaries can actually save lives. They talk about the settlers, soldiers, and prisoners of war who kept diaries in order to relieve the monotony and brutality of daily life and preserve their sanity. I'm sure that this relieving and preserving was a factor for a certain young prisoner of war named Anne Frank, who managed to maintain her faith in the goodness of humanity right up to her final entry. And for people like Sylvia Plath and Virginia Woolf, I wonder if their suicide deaths would have happened sooner had they not kept diaries and thereby asserted their otherwise too tenuous individuality. Diaries are a way of communing with and honoring oneself and one's life, which is, to quote diarist Sidney George Fisher, all I have as a position in this great busy world which knows and cares nothing about me. This sentiment echoes one expressed by the Reverend Francis Kilvert, as referenced in another fantastic diary anthology called The Assassin's Cloak. In response to asking himself why he keeps his voluminous journal, Kilvert says, "Partly because life appears to me such a curious and wonderful thing that it almost seems a pity that even such a humble and uneventful life as mine should pass altogether away without some such record as this, and partly, too, because I think the record may amuse and interest some who come after me." In his fabulous essay, The Diary Habit, written around 1918, Arnold Bennett says that most people are terrified of the written word, that is, of writing anything true and honest. He says that, quote, "The honest written word possesses a mysterious and intimidating power. It is one thing to think a thought or feel a feeling. It is something else entirely to see that thought or feeling on the page. For this reason, most people are too faint of heart to keep a diary that is, quote, absolutely true. When you set out to cultivate a diary habit," Bennett says, "you must do it solemnly, quote, with a due appreciation of the difficulties thereby initiated. The very essence of a diary is truth. A diary of untruth would be pointless, and to attain truth is the hardest thing on earth. Even to attain falsehood," he says, "is decidedly a feat." Bennett goes on to address another common reason, aside from sheer terror, that people give for not starting a diary. They think their lives aren't interesting enough. He encourages such people to bear in mind that an observation that seems mundane to them today will be fascinating for others, including their future selves, after some time has passed. We take so much for granted about our daily lives, oblivious to the losses that could strike at any moment, and retrospectively render poignant a seemingly commonplace mention of a friend, pet, husband, job, home, etc. As Irene and Alan Taylor say in the introduction to their Assassin's Cloak anthology, it is that which many people might not deem worth recording which sheds the most brilliant light on the diarist's character or illuminates the times in which they lived. My grandmother's life, for instance, was not exceptionally interesting. She wasn't famous, wasn't a genius, didn't fight in any wars or cure any diseases. Her diary chronicles her days at school and playing with friends, and the movies she saw, and going to church, and practicing the piano, and singing with her father in the kitchen, and feeling frustrated with her mother, and wondering about God and the weather. And they are thrilling. I mean, this is someone's real life, and these people she's always writing about, they were real too, and had their own private thoughts and ways of seeing the world. It's truly extraordinary. That's what happens to an ordinary life when you write it down. It becomes extraordinary. I think it's almost alchemical what happens when we document our days. In preserving a day in words on paper, we imbue it with a sacred importance. I know I'm biased where my grandmother's diaries are concerned, and that not everyone will find them as fascinating and important as I do. I knew her in real life, after all. Indeed, I owe her my own life, because if she'd never lived and given birth to my father, I wouldn't have been born. I'm sure her diaries are more interesting to me than they would be to a stranger, but any stranger who doesn't find them at least a little interesting for historical reasons or for what they portray about the human condition is quite frankly no one I'd want to know. But while my grandmother's diaries admittedly fascinate me more than any others ever could, I do still find other diaries written by unfamous, obscure people deeply compelling. There's a special collections room in the library at UNCA, which contains the diary of one Henry Scadden. I've read his 1886 and 1887 diaries, and I'm making my way through his 1888 one now. And despite the short, factual nature of his entries, I feel like I know Henry, this 25, then 26, and soon-to-be 27-year-old Michigander, husband to Kate, father to Johnny, who died as a toddler, and then father to Una, now still an infant, brother to Effie, who recently, in Henry's diary world anyway, died quite suddenly of an unspecified illness. Henry struggles with bouts of depression and a lack of confidence generally. He practices penmanship and has even taught it at the local college, which he hated doing. He grows fruit trees and has a horse named Jimmy. He loves his wife, and he is a caring son to both of his parents, writing them letters regularly and visiting when he can. I'll just say it. I love Henry Scadden. I really do feel real love for him. From his diaries, I can tell he was a good, decent, sensitive man who always tried his best. And I am so glad that he kept a diary so that I could have the pleasure of loving him now, 133 years later. Same goes for Cornelia Henry. You can find her diary in the North Carolina room of the Pack Library downtown, and you can also read it in published book form, which is titled Fear in North Carolina, the Civil War Journals and Letters of the Henry Family. We have Rick Russell and Karen Kleinard to thank for that book. You may have heard Rick on the Asheville FM music show, Riffin'. He once gave me a tour of the Malvern Hills neighborhood, that's right up the road from the radio station, showing me Cornelia Henry's stomping grounds. It was a ghostly good time. To think that this same earth was what she used to tread every day, this cemetery where she mourned all the lost ones. I've read Cornelia's diaries from 1862 and 1863, when she was 25 and 26, and there are more where those came from. She mostly writes about the work she did that day, lots of cooking, sewing, knitting, dyeing, how her many small children are doing, how her teeth ache, how her head aches, how much she loves her husband, whom she calls Mr. Henry, and any updates on the war. And while Cornelia may have been on the wrong side of that war, she was doing her best with what she knew, felt, believed, and experienced, which is all any of us ever do. And she cared enough to write it all down. And for those reasons, I love her just as I love Henry Scadden. I think this goes to show that in many ways, to know is to love. In any case, we can never love what we don't know. And of course, knowledge occurs on a spectrum. I don't fool myself into thinking that I really know Henry and Cornelia, or even that I really know my grandmother, despite her revealing far more of her cognitive and emotional landscapes in her diaries. No diary could ever contain a whole person. If it did, that person would probably have a diagnosable mental illness of some kind. Life is not meant to be contained in words. It is too big, and words are too small. I could read your diary every day and not really know you, but I'd definitely know you much better than if I hadn't read it, even if all you wrote about was what you did each day. Indeed, it is the commonplace and the trivial that make the best diaries so compelling. When I inherited my grandmother's diaries in 2016, I soon became interested in all things diary and did some research on why people keep diaries in the first place. What is that drive made of? Though I'd been a regular journaler for years, I couldn't even articulate my own reasons for documenting my life. It just seemed kind of crazy not to. And at that time, I hadn't felt the strong need to document every day's events, but I did feel compelled to write at least a few times a week to check in with my notebook, which was essentially my future self, I guess, whom I imagined would feel hurt if overly neglected. But it also just felt necessary to keep track of my life in some consistent way. Nobody else was keeping track of it. My 10-year-old niece, Marielle, recently touched on something else that I think feeds the diary or journal habit in many people. She started keeping her own diary about a year ago, and here's what she has to say about why.
I find it very satisfying to write down what happens.
I find it very satisfying to write down what happens. Ding, ding, ding. She nailed it there. Only certain types of people can take satisfaction in writing down what happens, and those are the people who can maintain a diary habit. That very satisfaction or pleasure is what Arnold Bennett ultimately says is the only reason a person should start and continue with a diary at all. In his essay, The Diary Habit, which you can read, by the way, at artofmanliness.com, he acknowledges that one can profit from diary writing in that it's an external hard drive of sorts, remembering things for us that our brains never could, and that one can find pleasure in reading their own diaries years later, as has been the case for my dad.
One benefit of keeping the diary and rereading the diary is periodically I'll find entries that I want to share with other people who were involved in those entries. And it's just a really fun way to keep up with people. I'll send somebody an entry of something that happened 30 years ago and say, can you believe that was 30 years ago? Mm-hmm. By the way, how are you doing?
Yeah.
So, it's a good way to keep up with old friends.
I'm sure that Arnold Bennett would agree that such opportunities for interpersonal connection can be a perk to keeping a diary, and I'm sure my dad would agree that it's not the reason he's kept one for the past 36 years and 7 months. He's done it because
I love history, and I've always had a very bad memory. So I thought it would be nice if I could remember my own history, so I started writing it down.
But more than that, I think he's done it because he enjoys it. He's been writing in that diary every day since I was 2.5 years old, and I've never once heard him gripe about it. He maintains the habit by chipping away at it. When he comes to visit me in Asheville, he'll write while sipping his coffee in the morning, and then he'll pull the diary out again in the afternoon. When I was a kid, he'd often look up from writing and ask me what the last name was of the friend I'd played with that day, and I'd feel special, like my friends mattered to him. It's one of the most comforting images I can think of, the sight of my dad sitting at a table writing in his diary. I'm sure it would not be comforting were he not enjoying himself, and I'm sure that any diary written in a begrudging attitude would not be a pleasure to read. Which isn't to say that the content of the diary should always be pleasant and upbeat. No, thank you. It's just to say that the act of writing should feel to the writer like its own kind of benefit, an end in itself. As Arnold Bennett says, a diary should find its sufficient justification in the writing of it. If the act of writing is not its own reward, then let the diary remain forever unwritten. Along with Arnold Bennett, another person who had strong feelings about keeping a diary was Brenda Ueland. Her book, If You Want to Write, published in 1938, is one of my all-time most beloved. Some of its chapter titles include Everybody is Talented, Original, and Has Something to Say. The Imagination Works Slowly and Quietly. Be careless, reckless, be a lion, be a pirate when you write. people confuse the human and the divine ego. You do not know what is in you, an inexhaustible fountain of ideas. And my favorite, keep a slovenly, headlong, impulsive, honest diary. In this chapter, she talks about the importance of allowing oneself to write badly, if one desires to write well, and how diaries offer just such an opportunity. Ueland is not referring to what she calls a had lunch diary, though. She instructs aspiring writers to write as often as they can and as fast and as carelessly as they can, anything they think, see, or feel in a day. She also suggests they wait 6 months before reading any of it. You will see, she says, that what you have written with the most slovenly freedom, in those parts there will be vitality, brilliance, and beauty. By writing fast, we can only touch on what really interests us. There is no time for the dutiful and the boring. We will, quote, sail over the quagmire of wordy explanations and timidly qualifying phrases. Ueland says that all people see and feel things sparklingly, but it is all dulled and lost before it gets out on paper. So writing as much as possible, as fast as possible, increases one's chances of harnessing that sparkle. Ueland herself kept such a helter-skelter diary for many years, and in If You Want to Write, she attests to its being a great help to her. It showed her, first of all, that writing is essentially talking and thinking on paper, and the closer it can be to thinking, the more immediate feeling it will be. Arnold Bennett, although a much stodgier-seeming sort than Ueland, who was 24 years his junior, would agree with her. In his diary habit essay, he says that people who are intimidated by writing are, quote, under the delusion that writing is essentially different from talking, and they are not aware that he who says or thinks interesting things can write interesting things. The trick is to actually do the writing. And while your writing doesn't always have to be the same as your talking or thinking, he says that it should be so in your diary. For Ueland, the second benefit of keeping a helter-skelter diary was that it made her like writing, which for so long had been, quote, the most boring, dreaded, and effortful thing to do, doubt-impeded, ego-inflated. Bennett would understand that Ueland once hated writing because she was too focused on writing correctly. He argued that such formality in a diary would be a mistake. Write as you think, as you speak, he said, and it may be given to you to produce literature. But if while you are writing you remember that there is such a thing as literature, you will assuredly never produce literature. But again, you will produce nothing if you don't do the work of actually writing words down. To maintain a respectable diary habit, Bennett says, it is necessary to conquer the human objection to hard labor of any sort. Yes, it should be a pleasurable pastime, but it is also a task, a responsibility, and to neglect it can often seem a desirable option. But, Bennett says, in diary keeping, negligence cannot be repaired. That which is gone beyond return. Lastly, Ueland's slovenly, headlong, impulsive, honest diary showed her, more and more, who and what she really was. Quote, what to discard in myself and what to respect and love. It showed her, too, that she had within herself a, quote, inexhaustible fountain of ideas. In If You Want to Write, she asserts that every person has this endless well of genius inside. Thing is, most of us aren't aware of it, because most of us aren't lucky enough to, quote, know very intelligent, imaginative, sympathetic people who love us and have the magnanimity to encourage us, to believe in us, by listening, by praise, by appreciation, by laughing. In this relative or all-out absence of such people in our lives, we can turn to a diary with our innate conviction, one we all possess, that we contain a fire, a richness, an inner importance, a God within. At the beginning of the show, I mentioned that my own approach to writing about my life has changed of late. On January 1st of this year, actually, I started keeping a diary proper, as opposed to the journals I'd been writing up to then, which I didn't write in every day, and which tended to focus on my mental and emotional processes more than what actually happened each day. But when my husband gave me a Moleskine planner for Christmas, a beautiful bright red thing with an entire page devoted to each day, after I'd already purchased the same planner I've been using for the past few years with much success, I decided to use it as a diary. A real diary, like the kind my dad has kept since 1985, and like his mother before him kept for so many years of her life. Some days I have to work at finding enough to say to fill the entire vast page, and others I have to work at condensing my day into that tiny space. Either way, the space gets filled. It's a rule I've made for myself. And since 2018, I've kept a 5-year diary. These little guys can be a great option for people who like the idea of keeping a diary but don't necessarily want to write a lot. Each page of a 5-year diary contains 5 small spaces to document the down and dirty basics. Once you've filled the uppermost space of each page for an entire year, you then go back to the beginning of the book and fill in the second to the top space with each day's events, and so on through the years for 5 years. This format allows for the ever-entertaining activity of comparing this year's August 12th to last year's August 12th, and to other August 12ths reaching farther back in time, depending on how dedicated a diarist you've been. My grandmother wrote in a 5-year diary in 1944, but she never even tried to use it properly. She filled up multiple pages for each day, paying no mind to the 5 sections. She simply could not be contained when it came to how much she wanted, or maybe needed, to write. I thought I'd share one of her entries with you before signing off today. It's one that I've posted on YouTube in the comments section to a 1941 film called How Green Was My Valley. It beat Citizen Kane for Best Picture at the Oscars. Grammy saw this movie with her best friend Mary at the Princess Theater, which still exists, in Harriman, Tennessee, when she was 17 years old. Here's what she wrote about it on January 19th, 1942. From the very beginning I cried, although it really wasn't sad then, but just little things they said or even scenes made the tears come. It was the story of a Welsh mining village, mostly of the Morgan family. There were 5 grown sons, Hugh, the little boy, a daughter, Angarad, and the kindly, lovable father and plump Welsh mother. The sons and father all worked in the village coal mines, even the little fellow near the end. Walter Pidgeon was the minister who loved Angarad too much to marry her. He wanted to save her from a life of poverty and work. He was so beautiful. The whole picture, so human and so sad, was beautiful. Wonderfully acted, wonderfully directed, wonderful entertainment in spite of no definite plot. I should like to see it 100 times over. Mary and I wept to our heart's content, clasped hands in excitement or sorrow every so often, and thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it. The passing of time is very sad, though, isn't it? And beautiful memories of a past which is gone forever is too sad for tears even. It gives me a funny ache someplace inside whenever I think of it. Movies like that are as good as a sermon in church. Better than a lot, I dare say. Sitting there with people all around and my dearest friend so close beside, with the beautiful story on the screen before me, I felt so uplifted, so unafraid, so glorious. I wish that I might tell you my thoughts then, diary, but they cannot be written or even spoken. Since I shared that entry on YouTube about a year ago, a surprising number of people have liked it and even taken the time to reply, expressing the sincerest gratitude for Grammy's words. They told me about sharing the entry with loved ones, commented on how funny it was that Grammy was longing for the past, and we today are longing for her present. They admired how beautifully she expressed herself, how true her words were. and said how lucky and blessed I was to have her diaries. More than one person told me that they cried when reading her words. One woman said that she hoped my grandmother had lived a long, happy life. One man thanked me for sharing the words that he couldn't find himself for describing such a masterpiece. Someone by the name of P. Brazier 50 wrote, "Dear God, reading that diary entry carries you back 80 years into that small-town movie theater." Yes, it does, P. Brazier 50. That's how all of her entries are. Time machines. One man admitted that words were insufficient to convey how reading the entry made him feel, and he said my grandmother must have been a sweet gal. Yet another described her as extremely sensitive and highly intelligent, and another said they would have loved to have met her. Can you see how people are already loving her just by reading one entry? They already care about her, want to know her better, hope that she was happy. This is what diaries can do for those who read them. I believe this phenomenon is proof of the universally human desire to love other humans. It feels good to love in this way. I'd venture it feels even better than being loved. So if you don't think you'd enjoy keeping your own diary, you might consider reading some that others have written. Those 2 anthologies I mentioned, The Book of American Diaries and The Assassin's Cloak, are wonderful places to start.
I find it very satisfying to write down what happens.
Thanks to my niece, Marielle Miller, and my dad, Mark Simpson, for letting me use their voices on today's show. And thanks, of course, to my grandmother, Patty Ann Watkins Simpson, for writing about her one precious life in such profound detail. My own life is richer for it. And thanks to you for listening to Time and Other Thieves. I'm Sarah B., and I hope you'll check out next week's episode, which will feature a conversation I had with my husband, Whitman. Whitman knows a lot about climate change, and that's what we'll be talking about, both the current science of it and the spiritual challenges it implies. Take good care.